government, we'll go government and then defense.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. My name is Sasha Yusuf, and today I'm joined with my co-counsel, Mr. Joseph Clary.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon, both. Thank you. Defense, your appearances?
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon. My name's Elias Neibart, and today I'm joined by my colleague, Mr. John Murrow.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
And together we represent the defendant, Carrabassett.
Thank you very much. We will now hear opening statements from each party. Everyone should make sure that they are in speaker view. That button is in the upper right of your screen. Attorneys, please remember to mute your own audio when the other attorney is speaking. We will go ahead and proceed with an opening from the government.
Your Honor, we actually just have some pre-trial matters we'd like to discuss before proceeding into opening statements.
Okay, sure.
Your Honor, at this time, we'd like to invoke Rule 615, which constructively sequesters witnesses from the trial today.
All right. Any objection from the defense?
No objection, Your Honor. We'll just note that that rule does not apply to party representatives, and Ms. Bassett will be in trial today.
All right. With that note, Rule 615 is invoked, and the witnesses are virtually sequestered.
And Your Honor, we'd also like to note that Exhibits 4 through 33 have actually already been pre-admitted in today's trial. So the government will be using some of those exhibits in opening statements, but we just want to make a note that those pieces of evidence are already on the record and they're already admitted, and both parties have agreed to this.
Thank you. And defense, does that comport with your understanding? Okay, and that's my understanding as well. We've pre-admitted all the exhibits, and you may appropriately use them in opening statement. Anything else from the government?
Yes, Your Honor, just one more thing. We'd actually like to note stipulation number 14, which says that exhibit number 34, both parties have stipulated to the fact that the writing in blue belongs to Don Clark.
All right, and does that comport with your understanding, defense?
Yes, it does, Your Honor.
All right, so that is so noted. Do I have any housekeeping matters from the defense?
No housekeeping, Your Honor. We're ready for trial.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to hearing from both sides in this case today. Let's begin then with the government opening statement, and you may proceed, Mr. Yusuf, whenever you're ready.
Good morning, members of the jury. This case is about an obsession worth killing for. You know, they say that a picture is worth 1,000 words, so I'd actually like to show you something. Here are some pictures of where the defendant lives. This is the defendant's living room. As you can see, there's lots of elephants. This is her bathroom, where you see more elephants. And this is her vacuum cleaner, where we see another elephant taped on top. And there's also her backyard, where she has live elephants. Members of the jury, as you can see, she loves elephants. But today you'll learn that what might seem like a harmless obsession was actually worth killing for. And on August 18th, the defendant had a choice to make: the elephants or her husband. And you'll learn that she chose the elephants, and her husband, Mr. Don Clark, was never seen again. Because this case is about an obsession worth killing for. Members of the jury, you'll learn today that time and time again, the defendant argued with her husband on how they should run their elephant park. But at the end of the day, to Mr. Clark, it always came down to one thing. He would always say, as long as it's my money, we'll run it my way. And you'll learn the defendant didn't like that. These arguments, they resulted in threats, they resulted in violence, and members of the jury, you'll learn today that it resulted in a murder. That's because to him it was a business, but to the defendant it was an obsession worth killing for. Now today, I represent the United States of America. And today we're charging the defendant, Carrabassett, with count 1 murder. Now that just means that we have to prove to you 2 things beyond a reasonable doubt. First, we have to show you that she killed her husband. And 2, we have to show you that she did so intentionally and deliberately. And we're going to prove that to you today by showing you 3 things. How the defendant acted before her husband went missing, the day he went missing, and how she reacted after he went missing. So let's start with the first point. Members of the jury, just 2 months before Don Clark went missing, you'll learn that the defendant made threats against his life. And you're actually going to hear that from Special Agent Steph Johnson. He's going to tell you that Don Clark was so afraid of his life that he filed a restraining order. He's going to tell you that the defendant threatened to kill her husband. And that brings me to the second reason why the defendant committed this crime, members of the jury. You'll learn what she did during the day. That those threats, those were promises. That on August 18th, 2017, the defendant grabbed a horse elephant tranquilizer, a lethal dose of it, stuck it into her husband, and then she took his body to a swamp 130 miles away, dumped the body, and then came back. But members of the jury, the defendant left a trace of herself. You're going to learn that there was plant residue found on the bottom of her boots that matched exactly to the swamp that she went to 130 miles away from her residence. And finally, Your Honor, you're going to learn about how she reacted to her husband being lost. You're going to learn that 0 texts were sent to her husband when he was gone. You're going to learn that there were 0 calls made to her husband when he was lost. Members of the jury, you're going to learn that there was 0 attempt to contact her husband. And it's because the defendant knew exactly where he was. At the bottom of a swamp, lifeless and motionless. Because to her, this was an obsession worth killing for. That's why at the end of today's trial, I'll ask you to find her guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yusuf. Mr. Neibart, are you ready to open?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
Yes, you may. You may proceed.
Your Honor, Mr. Yusuf, members of the jury. Now, Mr. Yusuf just got up here and told you a story. A story about August 18th of 2017, and a story about an obsession worth killing for. But members of the jury, sometimes when we tell stories, we tend to leave a few details out. Now, what if I were to tell you that Mr. Yusuf, well, he left out the most important parts. Members of the jury, what if I were to tell you that someone did have a motive to commit this crime? What if I were to tell you that that person had contact with Don Clark just hours before he was killed? What if I were to tell you that that person has no alibi for the time of the attack? Members of the jury, what if I were to tell you that person isn't Carrabassett? Would that change things for you? Because members of the jury, today you're going to learn that the prosecution has the right idea, but they got the wrong person. Because today you're going to hear about someone named Lisa Clark. Now, Lisa Clark is Don Clark's ex-wife. And you're going to learn that Lisa Clark was suing Don Clark for $2 million. You're going to learn that Lisa Clark, she was prone to violent outbursts and threats. Members of the jury, you're going to learn that Lisa Clark, not Carrabassett, is responsible for this crime. Members of the jury, you're going to see that the prosecution has the right idea, but today they're prosecuting the wrong person. And that's so important, Because today the government is charging Miss Bassett with murder, which means they have to prove that to you beyond a reasonable doubt. Members of the jury, that's the highest burden in our legal system. And all that means is by the end of today's trial, if you still have some unanswered questions, if you see any gaping holes in the state's story, if you think they got the right idea, but they got the wrong person, well, then you must find Miss Bassett not guilty. But as the defense, we don't have a burden. We don't have to call a single witness, ask a single question, or present a single piece of evidence. But members of the jury, we will. We will to show you that the prosecution has the right idea, but they got the wrong person. Because today, members of the jury, you're going to hear from two witnesses, Steph Johnson from the government and Joe Kwong from the defense. And both witnesses are going to tell you a bit more about Lisa Clark. They're going to tell you that Lisa Clark should have been the government's primary suspect right from the beginning. They'll tell you that Lisa Clark never cooperated with federal investigators. They'll tell you that Lisa Clark was prone to violent outbursts and threats towards Don Clark. Members of the jury, they're going to tell you that right before the murder took place, Lisa Clark looked into her husband's eyes and said, "I will wipe you off the face of the earth." Members of the jury, you're going to see that the prosecution has the right idea, but they got the wrong person. So for the remainder of today's trial, I want you to pay very close attention to how Lisa Clark fits into this story. Because members of the jury, if you do, we're confident you'll see that while the prosecution may have the right idea, today they just got the wrong person. And that's why at the end of today's trial, I'll stand right here before you. And I'll ask that you find Miss Bassett not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Neibart. Government, are you ready to call your first witness?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the government calls Special Agent Steph Johnson to the stand.
Bailiff, I'm assuming the witnesses are already sworn. Is that correct? I can't hear you, Bailiff.
Correct. They're already
Okay. All right. I just remind you that that you're already sworn then, and you may proceed, Mr. Yusuf.
Good afternoon. Could you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Good afternoon. My name is Special Agent Steph Johnson.
What do you do for a living, Agent Johnson?
I'm a senior agent with the FBI, specifically in the Criminal Investigation Department.
How long have you been working with the Bureau?
I've been working with them since 2002, but it's only been since 2012 that I've held my current position as a senior special agent.
Do you have any specialized training?
Of course. My specialization lies in criminal investigative techniques, as well as interrogation methods and evidence collection.
Agent Johnson, now I want to talk about today's case. How exactly are you involved?
I was the lead investigator on the missing persons case of Don Clark that started back in 2017.
And how did you proceed with your investigation?
Well, the first thing we did once we learned that Don Clark was missing was we searched his home and his business, which happened to be in the same spot at the Tallahassee Elephant Park.
Did you arrest anyone during your investigation?
Not right away, but throughout the investigation, we eventually arrested his wife, Carrabassett.
Could you tell us why you arrested Carrabassett?
Sure. We had three main reasons for arresting Miss Bassett. The first, we found evidence that before Don Clark had gone missing, she had made threats against his life. We also found evidence to link her to a potential crime scene where we believe that Mr. Clark's body was disposed of. And lastly, after Mr. Clark went missing, Miss Bassett's behavior became suspicious and drew our attention to look a bit closer.
So, Agent Johnson, I want to break those three things that you mentioned down. Let's talk about the first reason that you arrested Carrabassett. You mentioned that there were threats made before Don Clark went missing. Could you tell us about those threats?
Of course. During our investigation, we found that Mr. Clark had actually recently filed for a restraining order against his wife, specifically due to the threats she was making against him.
And would you recognize that restraining order if I showed it to you today?
I'm sure I would, sir.
Mr. Clarion, could you please put up exhibit number 34 on the screen? Agent Johnson, what are we looking at here?
This is that request for the restraining order that we uncovered in our investigation.
Your Honor, at this time, we'd actually like to admit exhibit 34, only the blue statements made by Don Clark.
Are there any objections to that, Mr. Neibart?
No objections, Your Honor.
Okay, there being no objections, the exhibit is admitted into evidence and may be published. You may proceed.
So, Agent Johnson, where on this exhibit do you see a threat made from the defendant?
We see the threat where Mr. Clark was able to explain his request. He specifically states that his wife had threatened to kill him and that he was afraid that she was going to kill him in his sleep.
So how long before Don Clark went missing did he file this restraining order?
This was just 2 months before he went missing, sir.
Agent Johnson, was there anything on the premises of Ms. Bassett that was a lethal weapon to you?
Yes. We found that there was actually a few amounts of carfentanil, which is an elephant tranquilizer that she had on the site.
And how exactly is elephant tranquilizer?
Objection, Your Honor, lacks foundation. May I be heard?
You may.
Your Honor, Mr. Yusuf asked the witness to talk about if a substance was a lethal weapon or not. The witness hasn't laid foundation that she knows that carfentanil, the substance that she found at the elephant park, is in fact a lethal weapon. We just asked the witness to lay more foundation if she's going to testify to the specifics of that substance.
Thank you, Mr. Neibart. Your response, Mr. Yusuf?
Your Honor, that was actually my next question.
Okay, I will then sustain the objection and require additional foundation. You may proceed.
Agent Johnson, how exactly is this elephant tranquilizer lethal?
Sure. Well, the substance of this tranquilizer is actually about 5,000 times more toxic than heroin. Even inhaling this stuff would kill a normal person. Now, we learned this information from actually some of the data that Ms. Bassett had on site, where she had a safety log that went over these details, specifically how toxic this substance was for a human being.
And was the entire amount of this elephant tranquilizer accounted for at the residence of the defendant?
It was not. We found a log that showed how much tranquilizer they were supposed to have on site. They were supposed to have 24 syringes, but during our investigation, we only found 23, meaning that there was one full syringe left completely unaccounted for.
Objection, Your Honor. The statement lacks personal knowledge. May I be heard?
You may.
The witness just testified that the zoo was supposed to have 24 syringes in stock. The witness hasn't laid foundation that she has the personal knowledge to know how much inventory the zoo should have or should not have.
Your response, Mr. Yusuf?
Yes, Your Honor. This witness was the lead investigator in today's case. She actually told us that she reviewed logs that calculate how much of this drug that the residents should have, that this elephant park should have. She told us that while the logs said one thing, she actually counted a different amount, which means that there was a single vial that was unaccounted for. Your Honor, we believe that this is within her knowledge.
There was no objection to the testimony about the logs, and so I believe that she did establish sufficient foundation to identify a missing vial, so I will overrule your objection, Mr. Neibart. You may proceed.
Agent Johnson, now I want to talk about the second thing that you mentioned about the defendant. You said that you linked her to a possible body disposal site. What was that site?
Of course, that was a swamp we found about 130 miles away from the defendant's home.
And how did you know that that was a possible body disposal site?
We were actually able to use GPS coordinates to track a van that the defendant and her husband had access to. On the night that Mr. Clark went missing, that van left from their property to the swamp, in the middle of the night.
Did the defendant ever say that she went to that swamp that night?
No. When we asked her if she'd ever been to the swamp on August 18th or any other night, she denied having ever gone there.
Well, did you ever find evidence contradicting the defendant's statement?
We did.
What did you find?
We actually were able to do forensics testing of the defendant's boots and some other items located in her home. On that, we found plant residue that connected her specifically back to the swamp.
Now, Agent Johnson, I want to talk about the third reason that you mentioned you arrested the defendant. You told us that her actions after Don Clark went missing were suspicious. Do you know if her phone was operational during that time?
We do. We were able to look at the phone records for Miss Bassett after her husband went missing.
Would you recognize those phone records if I showed them to you today?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Clarion, could you please pull up the phone records of Miss Carrabassett? Does this look to be an accurate representation of that log?
Yes, it does, sir.
Now, according to this log, could you tell me the amount of times that the defendant called her husband after he went missing?
She never called him, sir.
Now, according to this log, could you tell me the amount of times that the defendant texted her husband after he went missing?
She never texted him.
According to these logs, is there any indication that the defendant attempted to contact Don Clark after he went missing?
No, sir. We found no indication that she ever tried to reach out to Don Clark after the day he went missing.
Thank you, Agent Johnson. Your Honor, I have no further questions at this time.
All right, thank you. Is there a cross-examination of this witness?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Now, Agent, a few moments ago, you told us what you believed happened on August 18th of 2017, right?
Yes, sir. I told you about the evidence we found in our investigation.
You believe that Carrabassett took an elephant tranquilizer, right?
That's correct, and poisoned her husband.
That's right, killed her husband with that tranquilizer,
Yes, sir.
and then transported his body miles away and disposed of it at a swamp. That's what you believe, right?
That's correct, sir. That's what the evidence pointed towards.
Now, you called that swamp a body disposal site. You said that, right?
Yes. Throughout the investigation, we believe that's where she got rid of Mr. Clark's body and why it hasn't been found yet.
So, Agent, you actually went to that swamp with the FBI, right?
We did. We conducted a full search of the swamp.
That's right. You conducted a full search of that swamp. You actually had police dogs looking for Mr. Clark's body, right?
That's correct.
Agent, you'd agree with me, you never found Mr. Clark's body at that body disposal site, right?
That is correct, sir. Unfortunately, by the time that Mr. Clark had been reported missing, over a week had passed since his actual disappearance. By the time we got to the swamp, we couldn't find any evidence of his body there.
That's right, Agent. You never found Mr. Clark's body at that swamp, right?
Or anywhere else, sir. That's correct.
That's right. You never found Mr. Clark's body for an entire year during your investigation.
Yes, sir. That is correct.
Now, Agent, you also talked about a syringe you used to inject Mr. Clark with that tranquilizer, right?
Yes, of the elephant tranquilizer.
Agent, you never found the syringe you believed killed Mr. Clark, right?
That is correct. The syringe was unaccounted for throughout the entire investigation. We believe it could be in the swamp as well.
Well, Agent, you never found it, so you couldn't test it for fingerprints, right?
Well, of course, sir.
You couldn't test it for DNA either, right?
Correct.
Now, Agent, you know that my client, Carrabassett, married Don Clark in 2011, right?
Yes, I am aware of that, sir.
But you know that before that, Don Clark was married to someone else, right?
Yes, I believe up until 2011, he was married to a Miss Lisa Clark.
That's right. Don Clark was married to someone named Lisa Clark, right?
Yes, sir.
Now, during your investigation, you actually wanted to speak to Miss Clark, right?
Yes, she was one of the people we wanted to conduct an interview with.
So you made contact with her.
Of course.
Agent, you'd agree with me that Miss Clark was acting pretty suspicious, right?
I mean, she didn't want to talk with us. She actually denied our request for an interview.
Yes, Your Honor. Speculation as to suspicious?
Do you have a response to that, Mr. Neibart? Speculation as to the word suspicious?
Yes, Your Honor. It's rationally based on the agent's perception if Miss Clark was acting suspicious or not. We're going to use subsequent questioning to show that Ms. Clark didn't want to cooperate with investigators, and to the agent, that seems suspicious.
Yeah, you may be heard, Mr. Yusuf.
Your Honor, we don't believe that the question as phrased called for a reasonable, a rational perception, rather a definitive term of whether or not she was acting suspicious, Your Honor. We believe that that is outside the personal knowledge of what this investigator would know.
Okay, so on the additional grounds that you have just raised, Mr. Yusuf, about insufficient foundation for a lay opinion, I will sustain the objection. Mr. Neibart, you may lay additional grounds for a lay opinion if you believe it's possible. You may continue.
Motion to strike until that foundation is laid, Your Honor.
I'm sorry.
Motion to strike until that foundation is laid.
I will grant the motion to strike.
Now, Agent, before you spoke to Ms. Clark, you actually interviewed other witnesses, right?
Of course.
You spoke to countless people, right?
Yes, we did.
Agent, everyone you spoke to before Ms. Clark fully cooperated with your investigation, right?
Yes. From the staff members we interviewed at the Elephant Park, as well as folks who were around the scene at the time, they were all happy to cooperate with our investigation.
Agent, Ms. Clark was the only person who didn't cooperate with your investigation. Isn't that right?
That's correct. Ms. Clark refused to participate in a voluntary interview.
Now, Agent, but you did speak to Ms. Clark briefly at her home in Orlando, right?
That is correct. We had one conversation, sir.
And she told you something pretty alarming, didn't she?
She told me that she hopes
Testifying.
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear you, Mr. Yusuf.
Objection, Your Honor. Counsel's testifying.
Do you have a response to that, Mr. Neibart?
Yes, Your Honor, but I believe I asked the agent if Ms. Clark said something pretty alarming. I was just asking a question, Your Honor.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
Yes.
Your Honor, I believe that opposing counsel using the phrase pretty alarming, he's putting words onto the record. Those aren't the witness's words at this point. Those are Mr. Neibart's words, so therefore counsel's testifying by using that language.
I'm going to overrule your objection. The witness can answer the question, and if she agrees, then it's testimony, and if not, it isn't.
Would you like me to re-ask the question, Agent?
Yes, sir. That would be appreciated.
Now, Ms. Clark, when you spoke to her at her home in Orlando, she told you something pretty alarming, right?
Yes, Ms. Clark told us that she had heard rumors that Ms. Bassett had murdered her husband and that she hoped those rumors were in fact true.
Agent, she actually told you that Mr. Clark deserved to die. She said that, right?
Yes, she did.
Now, Agent, you know it's important to conduct a thorough investigation, right?
Certainly.
When you conduct a thorough investigation, you get a better idea about possible suspects, right?
Yes, you do.
When you conduct a thorough investigation, you get a better idea about possible motives for a crime, right?
That's correct.
Agent, you would agree with me that Miss Clark had a motive to kill Don Clark.
I'm not sure I would go as far to say a motive to murder him. Throughout the investigation, we did see that they had quite the contentious relationship and what seemed like a pretty messy divorce back in 2011. But we never had enough evidence to prove an actual motive for murder on Miss Clark's part.
Well, Agent, you do know that Miss Clark was suing Don Clark for child support and alimony. She was doing that, right?
Correct. That was part of the divorce lawsuit back from 2011.
That lawsuit was for $2 million, right?
That sounds correct.
You know that Miss Clark continuously threatened Mr. Clark during that lawsuit. You know that, right?
I believe we heard about that. Granted, I never heard anything about that from Mr. Clark.
Hearsay? Or the foundation lies in hearsay?
Response to that, Mr. Neibart?
Yes, Your Honor. I'm simply asking the agent if during the course of her investigation, she found any evidence that indicated Miss Clark threatened her husband during their divorce settlement. It's not based on hearsay, Your Honor.
Your Honor, if I may be heard.
Yes.
Your Honor, these are words that are being said, that Lisa Clark threatened using her words, which are out-of-court statements, offered to prove the truth of the matter, asserted that she did, in fact, threaten Don Clark. Your Honor, this is hearsay.
Response, Your Honor?
You may respond briefly.
Your Honor, threats have no inherent truth value. In fact, threats fall under 803.3. They talk about someone's motive, intent, or plan. There's no truth value in a threat, Your Honor.
Your Honor, may I respond to that?
Very briefly, I'm ready to rule.
Your Honor, we would actually contend that this is hearsay within hearsay. While a threat might inherently not have a truth value, this detective must have heard from someone that there was an argument. And the statement made to the detective regarding the fact that there existed a threat would be the hearsay that we are objecting to.
Thank you. I'm overruling the objection.
So, Agent, you know that Lisa Clark actually threatened Don Clark before he went missing, right?
Yes, that is something that we were told by Miss Bassett.
Agent, you also know that Mr. Clark considered getting a restraining order against Lisa Clark. You know that, right?
That's correct, sir.
Now, Agent, you also know that Lisa Clark and Don Clark had contact on August 18th of 2017, right?
Yes, our phone records show that they had a brief phone call as well as further text communications that day.
That's right. You reviewed Don Clark's phone records, right?
Yes, sir.
You recognize them in court today.
I would.
Mr. Merle, can we see Exhibit 21, please? Now, Agent, you recognize this document in front of you, right?
Yes, sir, I do. These are the phone records we were speaking about.
That's right. These are Don Clark's phone records, some of which pertain to August 18th of 2017, right?
That's correct.
You know that Lisa Clark texted Don Clark at 2:35 p.m. on that day, right?
Yes, she did, sir.
Agent, you know that 2 minutes later, Lisa Clark and Don Clark spoke on the phone for 4 minutes, right?
That's right.
Agent, can you tell the members of the jury what that conversation entailed?
No, unfortunately, the phone logs will only show us the times and durations of phone calls. They don't actually give us a transcript of what was discussed in the call itself.
So, Agent, you don't know what Lisa Clark and Don Clark spoke about on that phone call, right?
That's correct, sir.
Agent, you also don't know where Miss Clark was on the evening of August 18th of 2017, right?
No, we do not, sir.
Agent, you don't know that because you were never able to confirm an alibi for Miss Clark. You weren't able to do that, right?
That's correct. Since we weren't able to interview Miss Clark, we weren't able to clarify those details.
So you don't know where she was, right?
That's correct.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
There is no redirect, Your Honor. May the witness be excused?
Yes, the witness may be excused. Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Yusuf, are you ready to call your next witness?
Your Honor, at this time, the government rests its case in chief.
Okay. The government having rested, defense, are you ready to proceed?
We are, Your Honor. At this time, we call Joe Kwong to the stand.
Mr. Kwong, I remind you that you have been sworn, and Mr. Neibart, you may proceed.
Could you please introduce yourself to the court?
Hi there, my name is Joseph Kwong, but I go by Joe.
Now, Mr. Kwong, what do you do for a living?
I'm a freelance TV producer. I make documentaries for a living.
Do you know the defendant in this case, Carrabassett?
I do. For about 3 years, I worked on a documentary about her and her husband and their animal sanctuary. I knew both of them pretty well.
Mr. Kwong, can you tell the members of the jury about Don and Kara's relationship?
Yeah, of course. I mean, from what I could see, they seem to have a pretty strong relationship. You know, Kara always called Don her gentle giant.
Your Honor, speculation.
Your response, counsel?
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Kwong testified that he was around Don and Kara for 3 years. Therefore, it's rationally based on his perception if the relationship was good, bad, or anything in between.
May I respond?
Yes, you may.
Your Honor, the exact words of this witness were that they had a strong relationship. Your Honor, we don't think that by being a TV producer and filming them that he would have the basis to tell us whether they had a strong relationship or not. He wasn't present during large portions of the day. He wasn't present during their home life, and he didn't always see them interact. Your Honor, we don't believe that they're able to make that conclusion. Is therefore speculative.
I'm going to overrule the objection. You can certainly explore those issues on cross-examination.
Now, Mr. Kwong, you were describing Kara and Don's relationship for the members of the jury. Could you please continue?
Right, of course. So, like I was saying, he always called her, or she always called him, her gentle giant. You know, he was very doting. He always got her everything she wanted. Of course, they had their issues like any other couple, but, you know, things always seemed pretty positive.
Now, sir, were you with Dawn and Kara on August 18th of 2017?
I was. We were filming that day. I spent most of the day at the animal sanctuary filming some interviews.
Were Kara and Dawn together for any portion of that day?
They were. I mean, they lived together, they worked together, so, they had a lot of interactions.
Can you describe how they were acting on August 18th?
Everything was pretty normal. No one was acting out of the ordinary from what I remember.
Were they fighting?
No,
Did Kara seem angry at Dawn?
no, they weren't fighting. Nothing like that happened at all.
Did Kara yell or say anything bad to Dawn?
No, nothing.
Now, Mr. Kwan, I want to shift focus and talk about someone named Lisa Clark. Do you know who that is?
Yes, I do.
How do you know her?
Well, she's Dawn's ex-wife. She would often come by the sanctuary to talk to Dawn.
Mr. Merle, can we see Exhibit 4, please? Now, Mr. Kwan, can you describe for the members of the jury what we're looking at here?
It looks like a letter from Dawn's lawyer, Mandy Tuminelli.
And Mr. Kwong, is Lisa Clark mentioned in this letter?
Let me see here. Yes, it looks like she is.
And what does it say about Lisa Clark in this letter?
It says that she was prone to outbursts and threats in person, by phone, and by text. I mean, that was completely consistent with what I was able to see.
Mr. Kwong, do you know how Mr. Clark responded to Lisa Clark's threats and outbursts?
Well, I don't really know if he did anything. I think he seemed nervous. He talked about being scared at some points.
Now, Mr. Kwong, what does this letter say about how Mr. Clark responded to Lisa Clark's threats and outbursts?
He actually was thinking about getting a restraining order.
And Mr. Kwong, have you ever saw Lisa Clark and Don Clark together?
Yes, like I said, she would come by the sanctuary pretty often, and I would see them, conversing, if you could call it that.
How would they interact?
I mean, there was a lot of talk about the lawsuit. Lisa was suing Don for alimony. She claimed that he had withheld some funds during their divorce. And then there were, of course, the threats.
Sir, you mentioned a lawsuit and some threats. I want to talk about those two things. Mr. Merle, can we see Exhibit 33, please? Now, Mr. Kwong, what are we looking at here?
This is actually Don Clark's obituary. He was declared dead about a year after he went missing, and I read it. It was in the Tallahassee newspaper.
And Mr. Kwong, what did you learn from this obituary?
Well, I learned about that lawsuit. I learned that it was over $2 million in alimony. Seemed like a pretty big deal.
And Mr. Kwong, you also mentioned some threats. You said Lisa Clark was seen threatening Don Clark. What exactly did you witness?
I mean, it happened on a number of occasions, right? But there is one that especially stood out to me.
What happened?
Lisa Clark said, "I will wipe you off the face of this earth."
And Mr. Kwong, when did that conversation take place?
It's not too long before he disappeared.
Mr. Kwong, I want to shift focus and talk about the day that Mr. Clark actually disappeared. Mr. Merle, can we see Exhibit 21, please? And Mr. Kwong, can you tell the members of the jury what they're looking at?
This appears to be phone records belonging to Don Clark.
Do these records show any texts from Lisa Clark to Don Clark on August 18th?
They do, yes.
Do they show any calls from Lisa Clark to Don Clark on August 18th?
I believe they do, yes.
Mr. Kwong, what time was that call placed?
It was at 2:37 p.m.
And Mr. Kwong, when was the last time you saw Don Clark alive?
The last time I saw Don alive was right before I left that night, around 6.
Thank you, Mr. Kwong. No further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Thank you. Mr. Yusuf, cross-examination of this witness?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may,
May I proceed?
yes, you may proceed.
Good afternoon, Mr. Kwong. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty well, sir. How about you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for asking. Now, Mr. Kwong, I actually want to talk about your work with the defendant.
Oh,
You've
sure, I'd love to.
You worked with her since 2015, right?
Yep, that's when they hired me.
And you worked with her for about 3 years, right?
That's right. I spent that time filming a documentary about them.
You would say that you interacted with the defendant a lot, right?
That's true.
You would say that you also interacted with her husband a decent amount, right?
Yeah, we were friends.
And Mr. Kwong, you also saw them interacting together, right?
That's right.
You actually saw them get into a couple of fights during your time, right?
Right. Like I said, they argued.
I want to talk about one of the arguments that the defendant had with her husband in the summer of 2017. You remember that argument?
There were a couple arguments, sir. What are you referring to in particular?
Well, there was an argument involving a vase, right, Mr. Kwong?
That's right, yes.
So let's talk about that argument. You know that the defendant actually wanted to turn their park into a sanctuary, right?
That's right. Kara always talked about wanting to turn it into a sanctuary. That's true.
But you know that her husband wanted to keep it a zoo, right?
Yeah, that was kind of the crux of a lot of their disagreements, is about the future of the sanctuary.
Because from what you saw, it was always business with him, right?
Well, that's what he said, yeah.
You know that the animals, they actually used to be in cages, right?
They did, actually. I mean, I haven't worked there since they've been in cages.
The defendant wanted them to be free roaming, right?
That's true, and it's my understanding that they are free roaming today.
Now, back when you worked in 2015, people were able to ride the elephants, right?
They were, yes. That was part of the park experience, as Don put it.
You know that the defendant, she told you she actually didn't want that, right?
That's right.
Now, when they had these arguments, you actually overheard Don Clark say that it is my money, right?
That's right. He did say that.
He said, I will run it my way, right?
That's correct.
And you actually saw the defendant grab a vase, right?
Right.
And throw a vase at Don Clark, right?
Objection,
That's
Your
right.
Honor, to improper character evidence. May I be heard?
You may be heard.
Your Honor, Mr. Yusuf's attempting to use this evidence of a violent interaction between Don Clark and Carrabassett in the past to show that she was more likely to act violently towards her husband in the future. That's improper character evidence.
Do you have a
Maybe heard.
response, Mr. Yusuf?
Your Honor, this is actually around the time frame of the crime. We're actually not trying to show action and conformity therewith. We're not trying to show that on August 18th, she took a vase and threw it at him. Furthermore, Your Honor, we're actually able to use a character evidence for a different purpose, such as motive, intent, or plan. Your Honor, we're using this to show a motive, that a reason why she committed this crime on August 18th, 2018 was because of that same argument that they had prior, Your Honor. This goes towards motive. We're not using it to show action and conformity therewith.
Response, Your Honor?
Yes, you may respond.
Your Honor, the defense is fine with Mr. Yusuf talking about that argument and the contents of that argument. But talking about that specific action, that throwing of the vase, that violent act, that's improper character evidence. It's using a past action by my client to show that she was more likely to act in accordance with that character trait sometime in the future.
May I respond, Your Honor?
You may.
Your Honor, again, we're not trying to show that there was an action, which was the vase, and that on August 18th, she acted in conformity with that action, that she actually threw a vase at Mr. Clark just later. Your Honor, action and conformity therewith means that a person engages in a certain action, and you try to show that they had that same exact action in whatever proceeding is relevant in today's case. Your Honor, we're not trying to show that on August 18th, she threw a vase at her husband. Your Honor, we're using this to show motive, which is allowed under the federal rules of evidence.
Response to that, Your Honor?
Yes.
I respectfully disagree with Mr. Yusuf's understanding of 404. The defense isn't alleging that Mr. Yusuf's trying to attempt to show that Ms. Bassett threw a vase at her husband on August 18th. but they're trying to use a previous moment where Miss Bassett acted violently towards her husband, the character trait of violence, to show that she was more likely to act in accordance with that character trait of violence, sometime in the future.
Okay, I'm going to sustain the objection and direct you that you may certainly inquire as to whether or not they had an argument, because that does tend to establish motive. But I am convinced that the actual throwing of the vase could be used for an improper character purpose under Rule 404. So you may inquire into the argument and leave the vase out of it.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Kwong, you actually continued to film the elephant park after Mr. Clark went missing, right?
That's right, yes.
You continued to film Kara, right?
That's right, I continued with all the same work I'd been doing.
And you actually saw Kara change the park, right?
That's right, like I said, she made those changes.
Well, it was because, Don Clark, he wasn't there to argue with the defendant about these changes, right, after he was missing, right?
That's correct, yes.
As soon as he was reported missing, she freed her elephants, right? She made them free roaming.
I believe so. To be clear, I haven't been working there the whole time. Since Ms. Bassett was arrested, I haven't been filming the documentary.
Mr. Kwong, you're aware that Ms. Bassett was arrested in September of 2018, right?
That's correct.
You're aware that Don Clark went missing in August of 2017, right?
That's right, yes.
So you worked from 2017 until 2018, right?
That's exactly right, yes.
So Mr. Kwong, you would be aware that they actually made these changes about 2 months after Don Clark went missing in October of 2017, right, Mr. Kwong?
Yes, exactly.
So that means that you were actually there in October of 2017 when the defendant changed it from cages to free roaming, right?
That's right. I don't know what's happened since 2018 at the park, but I do know that in 2017 she did change it.
Well, Mr. Kwong, I'm just asking you about what happened in 2017.
Okay.
And in 2017, when the defendant was there, she changed it so that they couldn't ride the elephants, right?
That's exactly right, yes.
You know that she actually changed the park to a nonprofit organization, right?
That's right.
You know that she turned that park into a sanctuary, right?
That's right.
Something that she's wanted to do as long as you've been there, right?
She has talked about doing it as long as I've been there, yes.
Now, Mr. Kwong, I want to talk about the defendant's obsession with elephants. You're aware of her collection, right?
That's right. Kara has a lot of elephant paraphernalia.
You were actually shown some pictures of her residence indicating some of her elephant paraphernalia, right?
Right, yes.
Well, when you saw those pictures, you know that that isn't even a tiny fraction of what she has in her house, right?
Right. Like I said, a lot of elephant stuff.
I want to talk about just how far she would go to protect her elephants. You filmed her on June 15th, 2017, right?
June 15th. Yes, I believe so.
That's one of the videos you actually submitted for today's case, right?
That's right.
You're familiar with your own work, right, Mr. Kwong?
Of course.
So I want to talk about what the defendant said in that video on June 15th, 2017.
Okay.
Mr. Kwong, the defendant said, "I will do anything to protect the elephants," right?
Right.
Mr. Kwong, the defendant said, "I will take people to their grave if I have to," right?
Yeah. Kara was a fan of hyperbole, but she did say that, yes.
Well, Mr. Kwong, you don't know if that was a hyperbole, do you?
I suppose I don't know for sure.
Mr. Kwong, she said, "I will take people to their grave" just 2 months before Don Clark went missing, right?
That's right. Yeah, it was the June interview.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kwong. Your Honor, I have no further questions at this time.
Thank you.
No redirect for the defense, Your Honor. We just asked that Mr. Kwong be excused.
Mr. Corn,
Thank you.
thank you for your testimony today. You're excused as a witness. I believe you had another witness, counsel?
No, Your Honor. At this point, the defense rests, and we're ready to move to closing statements. Excuse me, Your Honor.
Okay, are both parties ready to proceed with closing arguments, or do the parties need a brief break to collect their thought?
The defense is ready, Your Honor.
Is the government ready, or do you need a brief break, government?
Your Honor, we're ready to go.
All right, let's go ahead and proceed then. Mr. Yusuf? Whenever you're ready.
May it please the court. This case is about an obsession worth killing for. I want you to imagine a wife whose husband goes missing. She's hysterical. There's tears coming down her face. She's calling everywhere, calling the police, gathering a search party. She can't sleep. She can't think. She can't eat because she's so worried about his safety. She's doing anything and everything that she can to find where her husband is. But members of the jury, that's not even close to what the defendant did in today's case. 0. That's the amount of times that she texted her husband after he didn't come home one night. 0 was the amount of times she even tried to call him to find out where he was. Members of the jury, 0 was the amount of attempts the defendant made to find her husband. And that's because she knew exactly where he was. 130 miles away in a swamp. Dead, lifeless, motionless. This case is about an obsession worth fighting for, killing for. Now, members of the jury, as I said earlier, I represent the United States government in today's case, and today we had to prove to you 2 things beyond a reasonable doubt. That she killed her husband, and that she did so intentionally and deliberately. Members of the jury, we did that today by showing you what the defendant did before he went missing, during when he was missing, and after he was missing. So I want to talk about those 3 things one at a time. Let's start about the first thing. What happened before he went missing? Members of the jury, we heard from Steph Johnson that the defendant threatened to kill her husband once before. That she said, "Let me run the park my way, or I'm going to kill you." And members of the jury, he was so afraid for his life that he filed a restraining order against his own wife. But members of the jury, we know that this wasn't just a threat. Because on August 17, 2017, she followed through with it. That she took a lethal elephant tranquilizer out of her storage box. She put on her boots. She stabbed him with it, injecting a lethal dose, took his body to a swamp 130 miles away, came back and thought that she was scot-free. But members of the jury, she took something with her that traces her back to that same spot. Because there was plant residue. You heard from Agent Johnson that there was a specific plant residue that is found at that same swamp. A plant residue that was found on the defendant's boots. And members of the jury, normally that's not a problem. But we know that the defendant said, "I have never been to that swamp." So members of the jury, she's lying. But why does she have something to hide, members of the jury? If she didn't commit this crime, why would she lie to the FBI detective? Because members of the jury, she had an obsession worth killing for. And that brings me to what happened afterwards. Members of the jury, you saw call logs. You saw call logs that show exactly who the defendant texted. It showed exactly who the defendant called. And we know a couple of things. 0. That's the amount of texts the defendant said to her husband to see where he was. 0. That's the amount of calls the defendant made to her husband to see where he was after he was missing. Members of the jury, 0 was the amount of times she attempted to call her husband. And it's not because her phone didn't work. It's not because her phone was on airplane mode. It wasn't because her phone was dead. Members of the jury, she was using her phone. She was texting other people, everyone but Dawn Clark. And that's because she knew exactly where he was. She knew that those calls would not be going through because he was lying at the bottom of a swamp. He was lying dead because she had an obsession worth killing for. Now, members of the jury, Mr. Neibart actually told us that Lisa Clark could have done this crime. But look at those call logs that you have with you. Look at those call logs, and who's the person that is texting Dawn Clark? That's Lisa Clark. Lisa Clark is asking where Dawn Clark is. Lisa Clark is asking if he's okay. Members of the jury, Lisa Clark is texting his phone because she thinks that he will reply. Lisa Clark is texting it and not the defendant because the defendant knew where he was. Lisa Clark didn't. Members of the jury, this case is about an obsession worth killing for. For that reason, we're asking you to find the defendant guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yusuf. Mr. Neibart, whenever you're ready.
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Your Honor, Mr. Yusuf, members of the jury. There have been a lot of things said from the beginning to the end of today's trial. But there were 3 words that stood out to me in particular. I don't know. I'm up here asking Agent Johnson, can you tell us where Lisa Clark was on the night of August 18th of 2017? Can you tell us where she was? And Agent Johnson looks at us and says, I don't know. Members of the jury, doesn't that just encapsulate today's case? Because the prosecution never understood the entire story. They never saw the complete picture. They don't know who actually committed this crime. And that's why the prosecution has the right idea, but they got the wrong person. And that's so important. Because today is a murder trial, which means the government is alleging that Carrabassett killed her own husband. But members of the jury, today in court, it's our job. Not just to convict someone, but to convict the right person. So today it was the state's job, and the state's job alone, to prove to you so convincingly, beyond any reasonable doubt, that it was not just anyone, but in fact, Carrabassett, who committed this crime. So members of the jury, what does that mean to prove something to you beyond a reasonable doubt? Well, it just means if you have doubts or concerns about the state's case. If you have questions, you feel the state has an answer, well, then you must find Carrabassett not guilty. And now remember, it doesn't take 20 questions or 10 or 5. All it takes is 1. So let's focus on the one question the state, well, they haven't been able to answer.
Who? Who had the motive to commit this crime? Who had the opportunity? Members of the jury, if you just ask, who? You'll see the state, they have the right idea, but they got the wrong person. So first, who had a motive to commit this crime? Well, Mr. Yusuf wants you to believe that Carrabassett killed her own husband to take over the elephant park. He wants you to believe that Cara and Don were at each other's throats for months leading up to the murder. But members of the jury, what evidence have we heard in court today? Because the only witness that testified in court today who actually interacted with Don and Cara was Joe Kwong. And what did Mr. Kwong tell us? He told us that on the day in question, August 18th of 2017, Don and Cara weren't fighting, they weren't yelling at one another, they weren't arguing in any sort of way. But members of the jury, the irony is the state, they have the right idea. There was a person who was fed up with Don Clark. But that person wasn't Carrabassett. It was Lisa Clark. Because it was Lisa, not Cara, who was suing Don for $2 million. And it was Lisa, not Cara, who was prone to violent outbursts and threats. Members of the jury, it was Lisa, not Cara, who looked her husband in the eyes right before he was murdered and said, "I will wipe you off the face of the earth." Members of the jury, when we ask who had a motive to commit this crime, we see the answer is not Carrabassett. It's Lisa Clark. And that's just reasonable doubt. Now on August 18th, who had the opportunity to commit this crime? Well, the state wants you to believe that Carrabassett took a syringe filled with elephant tranquilizer, killed her husband, transported his body miles away, and disposed of it. But members of the jury, I have a couple questions for Mr. Yusuf. Where's Don Clark's body, and where's the syringe that allegedly killed him? You heard today the police investigated this crime for over a year. They arrested Carrabassett in September of 2018. And for an entire year, they couldn't find the murder weapon or the murder victim. Members of the jury, they can't prove to you beyond any reasonable doubt that Carrabassett killed her husband. So what do we know for sure? We know for sure that there was one person who spoke to Mr. Clark just hours before he died. We know for sure there was one person who would not cooperate with federal investigators. Members of the jury, there was one person who has no alibi for the time of the murder. And that person isn't Carrabassett. It's Lisa Clark. And that's just reasonable doubt. Members of the jury, don't ignore the evidence. Just ask who. Because when you ask who, you'll see the state, they have the right idea, but they got the wrong person. Now, members of the jury, it's important to note that as the defense, we don't have to prove to you that Lisa Clark actually committed this crime. That's the state's job and the state's job alone. But if you think there's a chance, if you think there's a reasonable possibility that it was Lisa Clark, not Carrabassett, who committed this crime, then you must find Miss Bassett not guilty. Because in this country, we have something called the Presumption of Innocence. And all that means is that when Miss Bassett entered court today, she was presumed innocent. As she sat through trial today, she was presumed innocent. As she listened to Mr. Yusuf accuse her of killing her own husband, she was still presumed innocent. And because the prosecution has ignored the evidence, because the prosecution has the right idea, but they got the wrong person, we're confident you'll let Miss Bassett leave this courtroom the same way she walked in. Innocent. We're confident you'll find her not guilty. Thank you.
Rebuttal, Your Honor.
Do you intend to offer rebuttal? I'm sorry. Are we supposed to do a time check here with?
Your Honor, I checked with my second chair, and I believe I have around 30 seconds.
Okay, you may use the entire 30 seconds for rebuttal if you'd like.
May I proceed?
Yes, you may.
Members of the jury, Mr. Neibart just came here and he spoke for 7 minutes. But for 7 minutes, did we get a single answer to why the defendant didn't call her husband when he was missing? Members of the jury, that's because it's unreasonable. And that's because we know exactly why. She had an obsession worth killing for, and that's why we ask you to find her guilty. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, at this time, the judges should complete their ballots and click submit